A single glance can be a doorway to a past you thought was sealed forever. Rachel Torres was 32 years old and drowning. Not in water, but in medical bills that multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish. $18,000 every month for experimental treatments that might buy her mother 6 more months of life. Stage 4 lung cancer didn't negotiate, and neither did Seattle General Hospital's billing department. Every shift at Morrison Steakhouse felt like running on a treadmill set to a speed just beyond her capabilities, her body screaming for rest while her bank account screamed louder. The pendant around her neck, a delicate silver locket with an intricate rose pattern etched into its surface, caught the dim restaurant lighting as she moved between tables. It was the only thing of value she owned, passed down from her mother on her 21st birthday with trembling hands and words Rachel didn't fully understand at the time. This is the family compass. It found its way back to us once. Maybe it will again. Dominic Ashford was 58 years old and suffocating. Not from lack of air, but from the weight of a question that had crushed him for 15 years. His empire, $847 million in real estate holdings spanning Washington, Oregon, and California, insulated him from almost every human problem. Signatures solved crises. Money erected walls between him and suffering. But there was one wound that no amount of wealth could cauterize. His wife, Catherine, had vanished on October 12, 2010, like smoke dispersing into Seattle's perpetual rain. No body, no ransom demand, no closure, just an empty space where a marriage used to exist, and one item missing from her jewelry box that haunted him more than her absence, a silver locket he'd commissioned in Florence, a piece the jeweler swore was singular in all the world. This wasn't a story about lost jewelry. This was about how one impossible object tore open a 15-year-old mystery and revealed that a missing woman never actually left Seattle. She was just buried deep enough that the rain couldn't wash away the lies. Morrison Steakhouse occupied prime real estate in Seattle's financial district, where leather booths the color of old money absorbed the secrets of men who controlled the city's skyline. The air hung thick with the scent of seared ribeye and the sharp bite of cologne that cost more per ounce than Rachel made in a week. The lighting was deliberately dim, designed to soften the aging faces of power brokers who gathered here to discuss acquisitions over 30-year scotch. The carpet was so thick it swallowed footsteps, creating an atmosphere of hushed importance, as if every conversation might reshape the economy. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows on this particular Tuesday evening in late September 2025. Each drop a tiny percussion note in Seattle's endless gray symphony. Rachel moved through this world like a ghost, visible only when needed, her feet aching in shoes she'd repaired with superglue 3 times already. She'd learned the art of invisibility, how to refill water glasses without interrupting conversations about stock portfolios, how to present a $300 steak without making eye contact that might remind wealthy men that poverty existed in the same room as their appetites. She was refilling water at table 7, her mind calculating whether she could skip lunch tomorrow to save $12 when she felt it. That primitive sensation that evolution embedded in human nervous systems, the prickling awareness that someone was watching. She looked up and found Dominic Ashford's eyes locked on her chest. Not her face. Not with the predatory assessment she'd learned to deflect from certain customers. This was different. His gaze was fixed on the pendant that rested just below her collarbone, and the color had drained from his face like someone had opened a valve. His hand froze halfway to his wine glass, suspended in a moment of recognition, so profound it seemed to stop time itself. For a man who controlled boardrooms with a single glance, who signed documents that displaced entire neighborhoods, he looked utterly shattered, as if he'd just seen a ghost wearing his dead wife's face. This wasn't a fairy tale. Real consequences were coming, and they'd been buried in Seattle soil for 15 years, waiting for a waitress wearing the wrong piece of jewelry to finally dig them up. Subscribe now, because what happens when the past refuses to stay dead gets darker than you think. The pendant wasn't just jewelry. It was a universe of impossible details that shouldn't have existed twice. Rachel had worn it so long she'd stopped noticing its weight against her sternum, but now, under Dominic Ashford's stare, She became hyper-aware of every facet. The locket was sterling silver, exactly 1.5 inches in diameter, small enough to rest comfortably below her collarbone, but substantial enough to feel like it mattered. The surface bore a hand-etched Tudor rose pattern, not stamped by a machine, but carved by human hands with a kind of precision that took days of work. 43 individual petals spiraled outward from the center, each one slightly different in size and curve, the way real roses grew in nature rather than in geometric perfection. A tiny ruby, no larger than a pinhead, was embedded at the rose's heart, catching light like a drop of frozen blood. The clasp bore an Italian hallmark that Rachel had looked up once out of curiosity. FG 1952. The entire piece weighed precisely 28 grams. She knew this because a pawn shop appraiser had weighed it years ago when her mother considered selling it during a particularly brutal winter. Her grandmother Elena Torres had received it as a wedding gift in Phoenix in 1975, or so the family story went. A mysterious benefactor, someone her grandmother never named, had presented it at the small ceremony in a South Phoenix church. Elena had worn it every day until 1998, when it vanished from her jewelry box during a move from one apartment to another. The family assumed it had been stolen, mourned its loss the way you mourn small deaths that accumulate over a lifetime of poverty. Then, impossibly, Rachel's mother Maria found it in 2003 at Rose's Collectibles, a cramped pawn shop on South Central Avenue, sitting in a display case like it had been waiting for her. Maria paid $50 she couldn't afford because she recognized it instantly. Every petal, every curve, the tiny ruby that caught the light. Dominic Ashford recognized it too, but his recognition carried the weight of something far darker than nostalgia. He stood from his booth with the careful control of a man trying not to shatter, and crossed the space between them in 4 long strides. Up close, Rachel could see the tremor in his hands, the way his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. When he spoke, his voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire restaurant. "Where did you get that?" Rachel's instinct was to step back, but years of dealing with entitled customers had taught her to hold her ground. "It's a family heirloom. My grandmother's." "That's impossible." He wasn't asking. He was delivering a verdict. "That pendant was custom-made in Florence in 2010. There's only one. I commissioned it myself." The restaurant had gone quiet. Conversations died mid-sentence, as other diners sensed the electricity in the air, the way animals sense an approaching storm. Rachel felt every eye in the room pivot toward them, felt the weight of judgment before anyone even knew what they were judging. "My grandmother had this in 1975, Rachel said, keeping her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Long before 2010, Dominic's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Your grandmother is either mistaken or lying. That hallmark, FG 1952, that's Filippo Gallo's maker's mark. He's been creating custom pieces in Florence since the 1950s, but this specific design." He pointed at the pendant with a finger that shook. "I watched him sketch it. I approved every detail. I commissioned it for my wife's 40th birthday, 3 weeks before she disappeared." The word "disappeared" hung in the air like smoke. Rachel's hand moved instinctively to the pendant, covering it with her palm as if she could protect it from his claim. "I don't know anything about your wife. This belonged to my grandmother. My mother found it in a pawn shop in Phoenix 22 years ago." "Then your mother is a thief." The words came out flat, emotionless, which somehow made them more vicious than if he'd shouted. "Or she bought stolen property. Either way, that pendant was taken from my home the night my wife vanished." "Which makes you," he looked her up and down, taking in her worn shoes and the ink stain on her apron, wearing evidence of a crime. Something hot and dangerous flared in Rachel's chest. She'd spent her entire life being looked at exactly the way Dominic Ashford was looking at her now, like she was less than, like her existence was an inconvenience, like poverty was a moral failing rather than a circumstance. She straightened her spine and met his gaze without flinching. "Then prove it." The challenge landed between them like a gauntlet. Dominic reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. He extracted a thick stack of $100 bills and threw them on the table, 50 of them, fanning out across the white tablecloth like playing cards. $5,000. Right now. Sell it to me and walk away. It was an insult disguised as an offer. The implication was clear. People like Rachel had a price, and it was lower than he'd pay for a decent bottle of wine. Around them, the other diners watched with a fascinated horror of people observing a car crash, their expressions a mix of pity for her and admiration for his power. Rachel looked at the money. $5,000 would cover 2 weeks of her mother's treatment. 2 weeks of borrowed time, purchased by surrendering the only thing connecting 3 generations of Torres women. She thought about her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, touching this pendant every morning. She thought about her mother's face when she'd found it in that pawn shop, the way she'd cried like she'd recovered a piece of her own mother's soul. No. The word came out stronger than she felt. Dominic's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from anger to something more dangerous, the cold calculation of a man who always got what he wanted and didn't know how to process being told no by a waitress. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "I have lawyers. I have resources. I will prove that pendant was stolen, and when I do, you'll face charges for receiving stolen property. You'll lose it anyway, and you'll have a criminal record. Take the money." Rachel felt the eyes of every person in Morrison's steakhouse boring into her back. She felt the weight of judgment, the assumption that someone like her would obviously choose money over principle. She felt the pendant against her skin, warm from her body heat, carrying the weight of every woman in her family who'd worn it. "If it's really yours," she said, "then you should be able to prove it. Show me your proof, and I'll consider your claim. Until then, this pendant stays exactly where it is." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the kitchen sound seemed to pause, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Dominic Ashford stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions Rachel couldn't quite read. Fury, grief, something that might have been respect. Then he picked up his money, slid it back into his wallet with deliberate slowness, and leaned in close enough that only she could hear his next words. "I will prove it. And when I do, I'm going to find out exactly how your family got their hands on my dead wife's jewelry." He left the restaurant without looking back, and Rachel stood frozen in place, her hand still clutching the pendant, wondering what she'd just unleashed. The confrontation at Morrison's Steakhouse replayed in Rachel's mind on an endless loop during the bus ride to Seattle General Hospital, each iteration adding new layers of dread. Her shift had ended early. The manager, uncomfortable with the scene she caused, had suggested she take the rest of the night off. The suggestion wasn't a kindness. Her mother's hospital room smelled like antiseptic and approaching death, though the nurses tried to mask it with lavender air freshener that only made everything worse. Maria Torres sat propped against pillows, her frame so diminished by illness that she looked like a child playing dress-up in an adult's body. At 61, she should have had decades left. Instead, she had months at best, and that was only if Rachel could keep paying for treatments that insurance deemed experimental and therefore optional, as if dying was a reasonable alternative. "You're here early," Maria said. Her voice scraped raw from the breathing treatments. Something wrong. Everything was wrong. Rachel's bank account showed $347. The hospital bill for this month was $18,000, and they were already 2 weeks behind on last month's balance. She worked double shifts at Morrison's and picked up weekend catering gigs, and still the math didn't work. She'd applied for assistance programs, crowdfunding campaigns, loans from predatory lenders who smelled desperation like sharks smell blood. Nothing was enough. The gap between what she could earn and what her mother needed to live was an impossible chasm, and Rachel was tired of pretending she could bridge it through sheer will. And now a billionaire was claiming the one thing of value they owned was stolen. "Mom," Rachel said slowly, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Tell me again about the pendant. How Grandma got it." Something flickered across Maria's face, a shadow of fear or maybe guilt. Her hand moved to worry at the hospital blanket, picking at loose threads with fingers that trembled from more than just illness. "Why are you asking?" Rachel pulled the pendant from beneath her shirt, letting it catch the fluorescent light. A man at the restaurant tonight said it was his. Said his wife owned it, and she disappeared 15 years ago. He says it was custom-made and there's only one. The color drained from Maria's already pale face. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at the pendant like it had transformed into something venomous. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Rachel had never heard before. Some doors are best left closed, Mija. What does that mean? It means Maria's breath caught, and she had to pause while a coughing fit racked her diminished frame. When she recovered, her eyes were wet but fierce. It means your grandmother received that pendant as a gift. That's the truth. But where it came from before that? She shook her head. I never asked too many questions. When I found it in that pawn shop in 2003, I knew I shouldn't have. Something about it felt wrong, the way it was just sitting there, like it had been placed for me to find. But it was Mama's pendant. I recognized every detail. How could I walk away? Wrong how? I don't know. Maria closed her eyes. I told myself it was a miracle, that somehow Mama's pendant had found its way back to us. But miracles don't happen to people like us, Rachel. We both know that. The words settled in Rachel's chest like stones. She thought about Dominic Ashford's face, the way genuine grief had cut through his anger. She thought about a missing woman, a custom-made pendant, and her own family story that suddenly felt full of holes. He offered me $5,000 for it, Rachel said quietly. Maria's eyes snapped open. Did you take it? No. Good. The word came out fierce, surprising both of them. That pendant is ours. It connects 3 generations of Torres women. Your grandmother wore it every day of my childhood. I gave it to you on your 21st birthday because, her voice broke, because I wanted you to have something that would last after I'm gone. There it was. The unspoken reality that hung between them like a third presence in the room. Maria Torres had 6 months to live, maybe less. The experimental treatments were buying time at a cost Rachel couldn't sustain, and they both knew how this story ended. The pendant wasn't just jewelry. It was the only tangible connection Rachel would have to her mother and grandmother after they were both gone, the only proof that 3 generations of Torres women had existed and mattered in a world that mostly treated them as invisible. But Dominic Ashford had his own grief, and it was 15 years deeper than theirs. Across Seattle, in a penthouse office overlooking Elliott Bay, Dominic sat in darkness and stared at a photograph he'd looked at 10,000 times. Catherine at 40, laughing at something he'd said, her hand raised to her throat where the pendant should have been. This photo was taken 2 days before he commissioned it, before he'd flown to Florence and spent 3 days working with Filippo Gallo to create something perfect. The pendant was supposed to be an apology, a physical manifestation of his commitment to being present, to prioritizing his marriage over the empire he'd spent 2 decades building. He'd given it to her on October 10, 2010. She'd worn it for exactly 2 days before she disappeared. The police had suspected him immediately. Statistically, the husband was always the primary suspect when a wife vanished. They'd torn apart his alibi, a business dinner with 6 witnesses that lasted until 11 p.m., looking for holes. They'd searched his properties, interviewed his employees, examined his finances for evidence of hired killers or payoffs. The media had crucified him. Real estate mogul under investigation in wife's disappearance. His business partners had distanced themselves. His reputation, built over decades, had crumbled in weeks. Then the investigation went cold. No body, no evidence, no leads. Catherine Ashford had simply ceased to exist, and the world moved on. Everyone except Dominic, who'd spent 15 years living in the questions. Their last conversation had been an argument. She'd been pulling away for months, and he'd been too consumed with a commercial development deal to notice until it was too late. That final morning, she told him she needed space to think. He'd responded with irritation instead of concern, said something cruel about her being dramatic. He'd left for work without kissing her goodbye. By the time he returned that evening, she was gone. Her car was in the garage. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. Her purse was in the bedroom. But Catherine and the pendant had vanished like they'd never existed at all. The guilt had hollowed him out. Not guilt over harming her. He knew his own innocence with absolute certainty. But guilt over failing her, over choosing conference calls over conversations, over letting the space between them grow until she disappeared into it. The pendant was the last gift he'd ever given her, the last time he tried to say, "I love you," in a language that might reach her. Its absence was a wound that never healed. And now a waitress in a cheap restaurant was wearing it. The impossibility of it had shaken something loose in Dominic's carefully controlled world. He'd built his entire life on logic, on problems that could be solved with enough resources and determination. But this defied logic. Custom-made pendants didn't duplicate themselves. Dead wives' jewelry didn't appear on strangers 22 years after being commissioned. The universe didn't work that way. Unless it did. Unless Catherine's disappearance wasn't what everyone assumed. Unless the answers he'd spent 15 years searching for had been hanging around a stranger's neck in his regular restaurant, waiting for him to finally look up and see them. Dominic opened his laptop and typed a name into his private investigation database, Vincent Chun. The best private investigator in Seattle, possibly the Pacific Northwest. If there were answers to be found, Chun would find them. And if Rachel Torres was connected to Catherine's disappearance, he needed to know before she disappeared too. Vincent Chun spent 3 days following Rachel Torres through her routine, and what he discovered made Dominic Ashford's conspiracy theories collapse like poorly built scaffolding. There was no conspiracy. There was only exhaustion wearing a human shape. Rachel woke at 5:30 a.m. in a studio apartment in the Rainier Valley that cost $1,400 monthly and smelled like the mold growing behind the bathroom wall. She took the bus to Morrison Steakhouse, worked the lunch shift until 3 p.m., then took another bus to Seattle General to sit with her mother until 6 p.m., then back to Morrison's for the dinner shift until midnight. On weekends, she picked up catering gigs that paid $15 an hour to serve champagne to people who wouldn't remember her face 30 seconds after she left the room. She ate one meal a day, usually whatever the kitchen was throwing away at the end of her shift. Her bank account showed $347, then $289 after she paid partial rent, then $134 after her mother's prescription copay. The math was brutal and honest. Rachel Torres was genuine, and she was drowning. Chen's report landed on Dominic's desk on a Thursday morning, accompanied by surveillance photos that made something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Rachel asleep on the bus, her forehead pressed against the window. Rachel crying in the hospital stairwell, where she thought no one could see. Rachel serving a table of executives who barely acknowledged her existence, while they discussed bonuses that exceeded her annual income. The pendant around her neck in every photo, catching light like an accusation. Dominic made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of lawyers and legal threats, he drove to Morrison Steakhouse on Friday evening and waited in the parking lot until Rachel's shift ended at midnight. When she emerged, shoulders slumped with exhaustion, he stepped out of his Mercedes and watched her freeze like prey spotting a predator. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said before she could run. "I'm here to propose a partnership." Rachel's hand moved instinctively to the pendant. "I'm not selling it. I'm not asking you to." Dominic pulled out his phone and showed her the surveillance photos, watching her expression cycle from confusion to anger to something that might have been resignation. "I had you investigated. I needed to know if you were running a con. You're not. You're exactly what you appear to be. Someone trying to save her mother with resources you don't have." That's invasive. Her voice was flat, drained of the fire she'd shown in the restaurant. "Yes," Dominic agreed, because there was no point in denying it. "It's also the only way I could know for certain that you're genuine, which means we have a problem that neither of us can solve alone." Rachel crossed her arms over her chest, the universal human gesture of self-protection. "What problem?" "You're wearing a pendant that shouldn't exist. I commissioned that exact piece, down to the microscopic imperfection in petal 17, in 2010. You say your grandmother had it in 1975. Those facts can't both be true, which means we're missing information. Dominic pocketed his phone. I need to know how my wife's pendant ended up in your family. You need money to keep your mother alive. I'm proposing we pool our resources to trace the truth. I don't trust you. You shouldn't. The honesty seemed to surprise her. But your mother's hospital bill is $34,000 in arrears. The hospital sent you a letter 3 days ago threatening to discontinue treatment if you don't pay at least $15,000 by next Friday. You work 80 hours a week and you're still drowning. You can't afford pride right now, and I can't afford to let this mystery remain unsolved. Rachel's jaw clenched, and Dominic watched her eyes fill with tears she refused to let fall. He recognized the look, the horrible calculation of someone weighing their dignity against their desperation and finding dignity too expensive to maintain. What exactly are you proposing? I'll cover all of your mother's medical expenses. Every treatment, every bill, everything. In exchange, you give me access to the pendant for examination and testing, and you cooperate fully with the investigation into its history. We work together to find out how one pendant exists in 2 incompatible timelines. And if the investigation proves you're right, that it's stolen. Dominic had thought about this question for 3 sleepless nights. Then we deal with that truth together. But Rachel, he used her name deliberately, trying to bridge the canyon of wealth and power between them. I don't think you're a thief. I think you're a woman wearing a mystery you inherited, just like I'm a man haunted by a disappearance I never understood. Our quest for truth is now inextricably linked. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the trap she'd been taught to expect from men like him. Finally, she nodded once, sharp and decisive. If you're lying about the medical bills, I'll find a way to make you regret it. Fair enough. The partnership began on Monday in Dominic's downtown office, where Rachel looked profoundly uncomfortable surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more than her car. They started with photographs. Dominic had kept everything from the pendant's commissioning, preliminary sketches from Filippo Gallo, photos of the creation process, the final product in its velvet box. Rachel removed her pendant and placed it on white cloth, and they photographed it from every angle under professional lighting. The match was absolute. Not similar. Identical. Every petal curved the same way. The ruby was positioned in the exact center, the same microscopic size. The hallmark read FG 1952 in the same flowing script. And there, on petal 17, was the imperfection that Dominic remembered watching Gallo create. A tiny slip of the etching tool that the artist had decided to leave because it made the piece human rather than mechanical. Dr. Sarah Kim arrived Tuesday afternoon, a metallurgist from the University of Washington who owed Dominic a favor from a research grant he'd funded. She examined the pendant under magnification, tested its composition with portable equipment, and delivered her verdict with the precision of someone who dealt in facts rather than feelings. Sterling silver, 92.5% purity. The rose pattern was hand-etched, not stamped. You can see the microscopic variations in depth and pressure. The ruby is natural, probably Burmese, based on the inclusions. The hallmark is consistent with Filippo Gallo's work from his Florence studio. Based on the oxidation patterns and where I'd estimate this piece was created somewhere between 2008 and 2012. Rachel's face went pale. That's impossible. My grandmother had this in the 70s. Then either your grandmother is mistaken about the timeline, or this isn't the pendant she remembers. Dr. Kim delivered the words with clinical detachment. Metallurgy doesn't lie. This pendant is approximately 15 years old. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Rachel stared at the pendant like it had betrayed her, and Dominic felt something shift between them. The first crack in the certainty they'd both brought to this partnership. What about the pawn shop? Rachel asked finally, her voice small. Rosa's Collectibles in South Phoenix. My mother bought it there in 2003. If the pendant was only created in 2010, that's impossible too. Dominic pulled up property records on his computer. Rosa's Collectibles. Closed in 2008. Owner listed as Rosa Delgado. Records supposedly destroyed in a fire. Supposedly. Convenient fires make me suspicious. Dominic leaned back in his chair. But pawn shops keep ledgers. They have to, for stolen property tracking. If Rosa Delgado kept records, and they survived, they might show who brought the pendant in. Where is she now? Rachel was already pulling out her phone, fingers flying across the screen with the desperate energy of someone chasing a lifeline. Got it. Rosa Delgado, 79 years old. Desert Haven Nursing Home in Tempe, Arizona. Their eyes met across the expensive desk, and for the first time, they were truly partners. Two people chasing the same impossible truth, no longer certain who was right and who was wrong, only certain that the answer was waiting in a nursing home 1,400 miles away. Desert Haven Nursing Home in Tempe, Arizona existed in that peculiar space between dignity and despair, where elderly residents waited for death in rooms that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and forgotten promises. Rosa Delgado occupied a corner unit with a view of a parking lot, which the staff cheerfully described as one of our premium locations. At 79, her mind remained sharp even as her body had surrendered to the accumulated betrayals of age. Rachel and Dominic sat across from her in plastic chairs that squeaked with every movement, the pendant resting on the table between them like evidence at a trial. Rosa stared at it with the expression of someone seeing a ghost she'd hoped was buried. "I remember that piece," she said finally, her voice carrying the rasp of decades smoking cigarettes. "You don't forget jewelry like that. Too beautiful for the neighborhood I served." "My mother bought it from your shop in 2003, Rachel said gently. "Maria Torres." Something flickered across Rosa's weathered face. Guilt, or maybe relief at finally being able to tell a truth she'd carried too long. Her arthritic fingers reached for the pendant but stopped short of touching it, as if contact might burn. "Your mother didn't buy it." "Not really." Rosa's eyes moved between Rachel and Dominic, calculating how much truth they could handle. "A man brought it to me in August 2003, paid me $500 cash, more than I'd make in a good month, to hold it for exactly 2 weeks. Then I was supposed to put it in my display case and wait for a specific woman to come in. Maria Torres. He showed me a photograph of her, said she'd recognize the pendant, said I should let her buy it for $50. The words landed like physical blows. Rachel felt the room tilt slightly, her grip tightening on the chair arms. "That doesn't make sense. Why would someone pay you to essentially give it away?" I asked the same question. Rosa's laugh was bitter. He said it was complicated, that the pendant needed to find its way to the right person without questions being asked. He said Maria Torres deserved something beautiful after everything she'd been through. She paused, meeting Rachel's eyes. "Your mother was a good woman. Cleaned houses for rich people who treated her like furniture. This man, he knew her somehow, knew her story." Dominic leaned forward, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Describe him." "Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Expensive suit, the kind you could tell cost more than my car. Cold eyes, gray, like winter sky." He spoke with a slight Boston accent, very precise in his words, like he measured every syllable before letting it out. Rosa closed her eyes, pulling the memory into focus. He had a scar on his left hand, between thumb and forefinger, shaped like a crescent moon. The description hit Dominic like electricity. He knew that scar. He'd seen it 1,000 times signing documents, opening doors, handling security protocols. James Morrison had gotten it in 1997, a knife accident during a camping trip with Dominic's father. The scar tissue had formed in a distinctive crescent shape that made his handshake memorable. "Did you keep records?" Dominic's voice came out strangled. Rosa nodded slowly. "Pawn shops have to log everything for stolen property tracking. I kept ledgers even for unusual transactions like this one. When my shop closed in 2008, I took the ledgers home. They're in a storage unit in Mesa. I couldn't throw them away, felt wrong somehow." She studied Dominic's face. "You know who this man is, don't you? I need to see that ledger." 3 hours later, they stood in a sweltering storage unit, sorting through boxes that smelled like desert dust and decaying paper. Rachel found it in the 4th box, a leather-bound ledger with 2003 embossed on the cover. The entry for August 15, 2003 was written in Rose's careful handwriting. Special hold. Silver pendant, rose pattern. Paid $500 by. And then a signature that made Dominic's blood run cold. The signature read J. Morrison, in handwriting he'd seen on hundreds of company documents. Back in Seattle, Vincent Shun pulled James Morrison's employment records while Rachel and Dominic sat in stunned silence in Dominic's office. The facts assembled themselves into a narrative that made horrible sense. James Morrison, 63 years old, head of security for Ashford Properties. Hired in 2004 by Dominic himself, recommended by his late father with the kind of absolute trust reserved for family. But the employment history went deeper. James had worked for Dominic's father's company from 1995 to 2010, handling security and special projects that were never fully detailed in the records. Chen's Interpol connections revealed something more troubling. James Morrison had taken a personal trip to Phoenix in August 2003, paid entirely in cash, no credit card trail, no company expense reports. The trip lasted exactly 3 days, August 14th to 16th, 2003. The same window when he'd visited Rose's collectibles. But the truly damning evidence came from Florence. Dominic had maintained contact with Filippo Gallo over the years, the kind of connection you keep with someone who created something meaningful. When he sent a carefully worded email asking about any inquiries regarding the pendant's creation, Gallo's response arrived within hours, written in Italian that Dominic had translated by a professional service. The translation read, "I remember this inquiry well, because it troubled me greatly. 1 week after I delivered your commission, a man visited my studio. American, late 40s, very intense. He asked detailed questions about the pendant's creation, the specific techniques I used, the materials, whether duplicates were possible. He offered me 50,000 euros to create an exact copy. I refused. The piece was custom art, created for your wife specifically. To duplicate it would be to violate the integrity of the work and my agreement with you. The man became angry, said I didn't understand the importance. I asked him to leave. This was October 19th, 2010. I remember the date because it was my daughter's birthday, and his visit ruined our celebration. October 19th, 2010. 1 week after Catherine Ashford disappeared. Rachel found the genealogical connection while searching public records at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, driven by the kind of manic energy that comes from realizing everything you thought you knew was constructed on lies. James Morrison had a sister. Patricia Morrison, 58 years old, worked as Catherine Ashford's personal assistant from 2008 to 2010. The employment records showed Patricia quit on October 14, 2010, 2 days after Catherine vanished. She'd given no notice, left no forwarding address, simply stopped showing up. Human Resources had marked her file abandoned position. 2 weeks later, Patricia Morrison boarded a flight to Costa Rica and never returned to the United States. Costa Rica, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. A country where someone could disappear into comfort and anonymity if they had enough money. Vincent Shun ran Patricia's financials through databases that existed in legal gray areas. What he found made the conspiracy snap into focus like a photograph developing. Patricia Morrison owned a villa in San Jose worth $1.2 million. Her bank accounts showed deposits that shouldn't have existed for a former personal assistant. Regular transfers from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, totaling approximately $2 million over 15 years. She was paid off, Rachel said quietly, staring at the financial records spread across Dominic's desk. Someone gave her enough money to disappear and keep quiet. Dominic's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. And her brother had access to my wife, my home, and my father's complete trust. He could have. He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the words that would make Catherine's fate real instead of theoretical. For 15 years, he'd lived in the uncertainty, and uncertainty allowed for hope. But this evidence was building toward a conclusion that would kill hope permanently. We need to talk to Patricia, Rachel said. She's the only one who knows what really happened. Vincent Shun was already booking flights to San Jose. I have contacts in Costa Rica, people who can find her, people who can apply the right kind of pressure. But Dominic, he looked at his employer with something like pity. Whatever she tells us, it's going to be bad. People don't flee to another country and accept millions in hush money unless the truth is worse than living with their conscience. Dominic nodded slowly, his face carved from stone. I know, but I've lived with not knowing for 15 years. Whatever the truth is, it can't be worse than the scenarios I've imagined. He was wrong about that. Subscribe now. The truth about Catherine's disappearance is darker than anyone suspected. Patricia Morrison's villa sat on a hillside overlooking San Jose, surrounded by tropical gardens that cost more to maintain than most Americans earned annually. Vincent Chun had located her in 36 hours through a network of Costa Rican private investigators who specialized in finding expatriates who didn't want to be found. Dominic and Rachel flew down on a private jet because some conversations couldn't happen over video calls, and some truths required looking into someone's eyes when they finally broke. Patricia answered the door in designer linen, her face carefully maintained through procedures that money could buy but couldn't quite naturalize. She was 58 but could have passed for 45 in the right lighting. When she saw Dominic standing on her doorstep, the color drained from her face like someone had opened a valve. Mr. Ashford. Her voice came out strangled. How did you? I need you to tell me what happened to Catherine. Dominic's words were measured, controlled, but Rachel could see the tremor in his hands. I know James was involved. I know you were paid to disappear. I know you're living on money that came from offshore accounts connected to Ashford Properties embezzlement. What I don't know is whether my wife is alive or dead. Patricia's face crumpled. 15 years of carrying a secret had carved lines that no procedure could erase, and now, confronted with a man whose life she'd helped destroy, the weight became unbearable. She stepped back, gesturing them inside with a hand that shook. The villa's interior was beautiful and empty. Expensive furniture arranged in rooms that clearly no one lived in with any real joy. Patricia poured herself vodka from a crystal decanter, drank it in one swallow, then poured another before turning to face them. Catherine's dead, she said flatly. She's been dead since October 12, 2010. The words hung in the air like smoke. Dominic made a sound that wasn't quite human, something between a gasp and a sob, and had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright. Rachel moved closer to him instinctively, though she didn't touch him, respecting the private nature of his grief. Tell me everything, Dominic managed. I need to know exactly what happened. Patricia finished her second vodka, and the story came pouring out like poison from a lanced wound. Catherine hadn't been planning to leave Dominic because of their marriage, though that was deteriorating. She'd been planning to leave because she'd discovered something that made staying dangerous. She'd always been meticulous about household finances, even though Dominic handled the business accounts. But in 2010, she'd started noticing irregularities. Payments from Ashford Properties accounts that didn't match up with legitimate expenses, shell corporations with addresses that led to empty offices, wire transfers to overseas accounts that had no business justification. Catherine had been a forensic accountant before she married Dominic, back when she had her own career and identity beyond being Mrs. Ashford. She recognized the patterns because she'd built her career prosecuting exactly these kinds of schemes. Someone was embezzling from Ashford Properties, and it wasn't small-scale theft. It was millions of dollars over more than a decade, routed through increasingly sophisticated shell companies. She'd started investigating quietly, creating spreadsheets and documentation that she kept on a laptop Dominic didn't know she owned. She traced the embezzlement to Dominic's trusted CFO and several members of the old guard, men who'd worked for Dominic's father and treated the company like their personal treasury. And at the center of it all was James Morrison, who'd been facilitating the theft for 15 years, using his security position to cover tracks and eliminate evidence. Catherine showed me the evidence in early October, Patricia said, her voice hollow. She trusted me because I'd worked for her for 2 years. She said she was going to the FBI on October 15th. She had copies of everything, bank records, wire transfers, corporate documents. She was going to bring the whole thing down. Why didn't she tell me? Dominic's voice broke on the question. She thought you might be involved. Patricia met his eyes directly. Your father had built the company, and these were your father's men. She wasn't sure if you knew and were complicit, or if you'd choose protecting your father's legacy over the truth. She loved you, but she didn't trust you. Not with this. The words landed like physical blows. Dominic sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with 15 years of misdirected grief finally finding its proper target. James found out, Patricia continued. I don't know how. Maybe he'd been monitoring her computer. Maybe someone saw something suspicious. But on October 12th, he confronted her in your garage. You were at that business dinner. All those witnesses proving you weren't home. I was still there. I'd stayed late to help Catherine organize some charity event files. I heard them arguing. Heard Catherine say she had evidence that would send him to prison for decades. Patricia's hands shook as she poured a third vodka. I went to the garage. I shouldn't have, but I was scared for her. When I got there, her voice cracked. James was standing over her body. There was so much blood. Her head had hit the concrete when she fell, or when he pushed her, I'm not sure. She wasn't moving. Rachel felt sick. Beside her, Dominic had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that precedes either violence or complete collapse. James saw me, Patricia whispered. He said it was an accident, that Catherine had lunged at him, and he'd pushed her in self-defense, that she'd fallen wrong. But his eyes, there was nothing in them. No horror, no panic. Just cold calculation. He said we could make this disappear, that Catherine's investigation would destroy Ashford Properties and put hundreds of people out of work, that Dominic would be ruined even though he was innocent. So you helped him cover it up. Rachel's voice was flat with disgust. He threatened my family, my elderly parents in Maine, my nephew who was 10 years old. He said he had the resources and connections to make them disappear too if I didn't cooperate. And then he offered me $2 million in offshore accounts, money he'd already stolen from a company. He said I could disappear, start over somewhere without extradition, never have to work again. Patricia's face twisted with self-loathing. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting my family, but really I was just protecting myself. We staged the disappearance, took her phone and purse out of the house to make it look like she'd left voluntarily. James disposed of her body somewhere in the Cascade Mountains. He never told me exactly where, said it was better if I didn't know. He kept the pendant as insurance, his word. Something to hold over me if I ever thought about talking. Then why did he give it to Maria Torres? Rachel demanded. Patricia's laugh was bitter and broken. Guilt, maybe. Or insurance of a different kind. Catherine used to talk about your mother sometimes, Maria Torres, the housekeeper who worked for her friend in Phoenix. Catherine had met her a few times, said Maria was kind despite everything life had thrown at her. I think James, in some twisted way, wanted Catherine's most precious possession to go to someone she'd cared about. It was his version of penance, giving away the evidence of his crime disguised as a gift. The room fell silent except for the sound of Dominic's ragged breathing. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was steel. Where's the body? I told you, I don't know the exact location. Somewhere in the Cascades, within a few hours' drive of Seattle. That's all James ever said. Then James is going to tell us exactly where. Dominic stood, his grief transforming into something harder and more dangerous. And he's going to pay for every single day of the last 15 years. The revelation about James Morrison transformed from historical crime to immediate threat the moment they returned to Seattle. Vincent Chun had continued investigating during their Costa Rica trip, and what he discovered made Rachel's blood run cold. James Morrison still worked at Ashford Properties, still had full security access to every building, every computer system, every surveillance camera, still sat in meetings where company strategy was discussed, still oversaw the protection of assets worth hundreds of millions. And based on Chen's forensic accounting, James had been embezzling for 30 years, not 15. The theft started when Dominic's father ran the company, continued seamlessly when Dominic took over, and had accumulated approximately $40 million in offshore accounts spread across the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. Their investigation threatened everything James had built: the wealth, the respect, the carefully constructed life where he was the trusted guardian rather than the thief and murderer he actually was. Chun found the listening devices on a Tuesday morning while conducting a routine security sweep that wasn't routine at all. Dominic's home office, 3 devices hidden in the bookshelf, the desk lamp, and behind a framed photograph. Rachel's studio apartment, 2 devices in the smoke detector and behind the bathroom mirror. They'd been sophisticated, military-grade equipment that wouldn't have been detected by standard consumer bug sweepers. James had been listening to everything. Every conversation about Patricia's testimony. Every piece of evidence they'd uncovered. Every plan they'd made to expose him. The anonymous threat arrived at Dominic's office that same afternoon, delivered by a courier service that had no record of who'd paid for the delivery. Inside a plain envelope was a single typed sentence: "Catherine's grave doesn't have to be lonely." The message was clear: stop investigating or join Catherine in the Cascade Mountains. The threat against Maria Torres came next, disguised as bureaucratic concern. A man claiming to be a hospital administrator visited her room, asking detailed questions about the pendant, where she'd gotten it, whether she'd noticed anything unusual about it, whether her daughter had been asking questions about its history. Maria, still weak from treatments but sharp enough to sense danger, had refused to answer and pressed the call button for nurses. Hospital security footage revealed the truth. The administrator was James Morrison in a cheap suit and glasses, his distinctive crescent moon scar visible when he gestured while talking. He'd walked through Seattle General Security like he owned the building, which made horrible sense. Ashford Properties had donated millions to the hospital's expansion. James probably knew every blind spot in their surveillance system. Rachel watched the footage in Chen's office and felt terror crystallize in her chest. "He knows where my mother is. He has access to her." "I've already arranged private security," Dominic said, his voice tight with controlled fury. 24-hour protection. He won't get near her again. But the damage was done. The threat had evolved from historical injustice to immediate danger. James Morrison had killed once to protect his theft. He'd maintained the cover-up for 15 years through threats and bribery. Now cornered by an investigation that would destroy everything, he'd proven he was willing to threaten Rachel's dying mother to make them stop. "We have Patricia's testimony," Rachel said, though her voice shook. "We have the ledger from Rosa's pawn shop. We have the evidence of embezzlement. Can't we just go to the police?" Chun shook his head grimly. "Patricia's testimony from Costa Rica is legally complicated. She's an accomplice who fled the country. Her credibility will be shredded by defense attorneys. The ledger proves James orchestrated the pendant delivery, but not why. The embezzlement is solid, but it doesn't prove murder. We need James to incriminate himself. We need him to confess to Catherine's murder on record, with details only the killer would know." Dominic stood and walked to the window overlooking Seattle's skyline, his reflection ghostly against the glass. "Then we give him a reason to confess. We make him believe he's already won, that the only thing left is to gloat about how clever he's been." "How?" Rachel asked. Dominic turned, and his smile was sharp enough to cut. "We throw a party." The Columbia Tower Club occupied the 76th floor of Seattle's tallest building, a space where wealth went to celebrate itself against a backdrop of the city sprawling below like a circuit board of lights. The annual Ashford Properties Gala was the kind of event that appeared in society pages, where politicians rubbed shoulders with real estate moguls, and the champagne cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. 300 guests in designer formal were circulated through rooms decorated with understated elegance that screamed money, so old it didn't need to shout. James Morrison moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who believed he'd won. He'd heard through his surveillance devices that Dominic and Rachel had gone to Costa Rica, had panicked briefly when he lost audio feed from both locations, then relaxed when they returned and seemed to resume normal activities. The investigation appeared to have stalled. His threats had worked. The pendant mystery would remain unsolved. Catherine would stay buried in the Cascades, and his $40 million would fund a retirement in a country without extradition treaties. He had no idea he was attending his own execution. Dominic stood at the front of the main ballroom, microphone in hand, watching James accept a glass of scotch from a passing waiter. Vincent Chen's security team was positioned at every exit, dressed as event staff, invisible until they needed not to be. Seattle PD detectives sat at table 12, invited as community partners, unaware they were about to witness a confession. 3 local news stations had camera crews present, ostensibly to cover the gala's charity auction, actually tipped off by Chun that something newsworthy would happen around 9 p.m. Rachel stood near the back, her mother's pendant visible against the simple black dress Dominic had insisted on buying her. Maria was watching from the hospital via laptop, protected by private security, her treatment fully funded, her daughter about to witness justice for a woman she'd never met, but whose memory had saved their family. At exactly 9 p.m., Dominic tapped the microphone. The conversations died like candles being snuffed. Thank you all for coming tonight. Before we begin the charity auction, I have an announcement regarding my wife, Catherine, who disappeared 15 years ago. His voice carried across the room with perfect clarity. I've recently discovered evidence that explains what happened to her. The screens throughout the venue, installed ostensibly for the auction, flickered to life. The first image showed the pendant in excruciating detail, every petal visible, the ruby catching light. Then came the Florence jeweler records, Filippo Gallo's sketches and creation photos, the commissioning documents dated September 2010. The Phoenix pawn shop ledger appeared next, zoomed in on the signature J. Morrison, and Rosa Delgado's handwritten notes about the suspicious transaction. James Morrison's face went white. He started moving toward the nearest exit, but found his path blocked by 2 of Chen's men who'd materialized like ghosts. The screens shifted to video, Patricia Morrison sitting in her Costa Rican villa, her face haggard but determined, telling the entire story. The embezzlement, Catherine's investigation, the garage confrontation, James standing over Catherine's body, the cover-up and payoff, her 15 years of cowardice and guilt, every damning detail delivered in her flat, exhausted voice. The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. James stood frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by 300 witnesses, as the screens displayed bank records showing his offshore accounts, wire transfer histories, the mathematical proof of 30 years of theft. The timeline of the cover-up appeared last, every piece of evidence arranged chronologically, creating a narrative so airtight that denial became impossible. Dominic crossed the space between them, his eyes locked on James with an intensity that made people step back instinctively. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of 15 years of grief. You didn't just steal 15 years of my life wondering what happened to my wife. You stole Catherine's future, her voice, her justice. You let me believe I might have failed her somehow, that our last argument might have driven her away. You watched me grieve, and you said nothing. James's face cycled through emotions, shock, fear, calculation, before settling on something ugly and defiant. Cornered animals became dangerous, and James Morrison had always been a predator. Catherine wouldn't listen, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. She was going to destroy everything your father built. 40 years of work, hundreds of employees, entire communities that depended on Ashford properties. She was willing to burn it all down over money that was already earmarked for retirement funds, for executive compensation packages that were standard practice. The confession spilled out like poison. Dominic hadn't even asked a question, but James couldn't stop himself. Arrogance and fury overrode 15 years of careful silence. She came at me in that garage with her laptop full of evidence, said I was going to prison for decades, said you'd be implicated too because you should have known. I pushed her it was self-defense, and she fell wrong, hit her head on the concrete. James's hands gestured sharply, demonstrating. It was an accident that spiraled, but I protected the legacy. I made sure Ashford property survived. Everything I did was to preserve what your father created. The room was absolutely silent. James seemed to realize what he'd done, confessed to manslaughter at minimum, possibly murder. in front of 300 witnesses, including police detectives who were already moving toward him. His face crumbled as the reality hit. "I disposed of the body in the North Cascades, near Diablo Lake, off Forest Service Road 3520, he continued, his voice taking on a desperate quality. "I kept the pendant as insurance against Patricia talking. Then guilt," he laughed bitterly. "Guilt made me give it to someone Catherine had cared about. Maria Torres. Catherine mentioned her daughter in Phoenix, said she was struggling but deserving. I thought," his voice broke, "I thought it was penance." The Seattle PD detectives reached him, and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut was audible in the silent ballroom. One detective began reading him his rights, while the other called for backup. The news cameras had captured everything: the screens, the confession, the arrest. This would be breaking news within minutes, viral within hours. James Morrison was led toward the exits, and he looked back once at Dominic. "Your father knew about the embezzlement. He approved it. You inherited an empire built on theft, Dominic. I was just following the blueprint he created." It was a final act of cruelty, but Dominic's expression didn't change. He'd already processed that his father might have been complicit, had already decided that truth mattered more than legacy. Rachel watched James disappear into the elevator, flanked by police, and felt something release in her chest. The pendant around her neck, Catherine's pendant, had finally done what it was meant to do. It had brought the truth into the light, even if it took 15 years, and traveled through 3 generations of Torres women to do it. If this story shows you why the truth always finds a way, subscribe, because justice delayed isn't justice denied. 3 months later, winter had settled over Seattle with the kind of gray rain that felt eternal. But inside the courtroom, justice arrived with unexpected clarity. James Morrison was convicted on all counts: second-degree murder for Catherine's death, conspiracy to conceal a crime, and 30 counts of embezzlement spanning 3 decades. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. His sentence, 35 years in a federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 25. At 63, it was effectively a life sentence, which felt appropriate for a man who'd stolen Catherine Ashford's entire life. Patricia Morrison received immunity in exchange for her testimony, an agreement to return the $2 million she'd been paid to stay silent. She'd aged a decade in the 3 months since her confession, the weight of carried guilt finally released, but leaving her hollowed out. She returned to Maine to care for her elderly parents, a broken woman trying to find redemption in the years she had left. Catherine's remains were recovered from the North Cascades, exactly where James had described, off Forest Service Road 3520, near Diablo Lake, in a shallow grave that had remained undisturbed for 15 years. The recovery team found her bones and a few fragments of the clothing she'd worn that October evening. DNA confirmation took 2 weeks, but Dominic had known the moment they found her. The not knowing had ended, replaced by a grief that was somehow cleaner than the uncertainty that had preceded it. The funeral at Lakeview Cemetery drew hundreds of mourners, people who'd known Catherine, people who'd only known her story, people who came because justice delayed was still justice worth witnessing. Dominic buried his wife properly, with a headstone that read, Catherine and Ashford, 1965 to 2010. Her search for truth outlasted her life. It felt right somehow that her investigation had continued beyond her death, carried forward by a waitress wearing her pendant. Maria Torres entered remission against every medical prediction. The experimental treatments, fully funded by Dominic, worked better than anyone had hoped. Her oncologist called it a miracle, but Maria called it something else. She called it Catherine's final gift, delivered 15 years late through a pendant and a billionaire's need for answers. She was well enough to attend the dedication ceremony for the Catherine Ashford Foundation, a $10 million endowment providing cancer treatment assistance for working families who fell through the cracks of insurance coverage. Rachel stood on the stage as the foundation's program director, a position that paid her more in salary than she'd made in 5 years of waitressing, but more importantly gave her purpose. She wore the pendant, the locket portion that Dominic had insisted she keep. He'd kept the chain, a division of the evidence that felt symbolic. Catherine's memory lived in both their lives now, connected by silver links, and shared trauma transformed into meaning. The final scene happened on a cold February morning. Rachel drove her mother to Lakeview Cemetery, both of them carrying armfuls of roses, 43 of them, one for each petal etched into the pendant that had changed everything. They placed them on Catherine's grave in a careful spiral pattern that mirrored the Tudor rose design, and Maria cried for a woman she'd barely known, but whose death had somehow saved her life. "Thank you," Maria whispered to the headstone. "For the pendant. For the truth. For my daughter's future." Rachel stood beside her mother in the gray Seattle rain and understood something fundamental. True justice isn't about wealth or power. It's about refusing to let the truth stay buried, no matter how deep someone digs a grave. If this story of impossible coincidence and delayed justice moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories of ordinary people who refuse to let mysteries rest. Share this with someone who believes the truth always surfaces, eventually. And comment below, what would you do if you discovered you were wearing evidence of someone else's tragedy? Because sometimes the smallest objects carry the heaviest truths. And sometimes justice just needs someone brave enough to ask the right questions.